The soft chime of church bells echoed across the quiet Sunday morning, signaling the start of the 10 a.m. service at St. Matthew's Parish. Sunlight streamed through the tall stained glass windows, painting the white stone steps with hues of crimson, gold, and blue. Families in their Sunday best filled the courtyard, greeting each other with polite smiles and hushed voices before heading inside. Among them was the Johnson family, David, his wife Angela, and their 9-year-old daughter Grace. They were new in town, having moved to Crestwood only a few weeks earlier. This would be their first time attending St. Matthew's, a historic church known for its beautiful architecture and long-standing traditions. David straightened his tie as they approached the double doors. Angela held Grace's hand gently, giving her a reassuring smile. Grace looked up in awe at the towering steeple. "It's so pretty," she whispered. Angela nodded. "It is. Remember, sweetie, we're here to meet kind people and feel welcome." But the moment they stepped into the lobby of the church, the warmth they expected was met with a piercing stare. Standing near the front pews, Linda Hastings, the same woman many in the community whispered about as Karen, watched the Johnsons with a look of immediate disapproval. Linda was in her late 40s, perfectly coiffed blonde hair, pearl earrings, and a posture that screamed self-importance. She had been a member of St. Matthew's her entire life and considered herself a gatekeeper of its standards. As the Johnsons walked down the center aisle, looking for an empty pew, Linda moved swiftly, blocking their path with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with a polite hostility. David paused, slightly confused. "Yes?" Linda's smile tightened. "I think you may be mistaken. This section is for long-time members. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable toward the back." Angela blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "We're just looking for a place to sit. It's our first time here." Linda's gaze flicked over their clothes, their faces, her expression hardening. "Yes, I gathered that. But you see, these front pews are reserved for families who have supported this church for generations. I'm sure you'd feel better sitting in the back section, closer to the door." Grace looked up at her parents, confused. "Mommy, why can't we sit here?" she whispered. Angela felt a heat rise in her chest. She straightened her shoulders, keeping her voice calm. "Ma'am, we're just here to worship, like everyone else." Linda let out a soft chuckle. "Of course, I'm simply trying to help you avoid any awkwardness. This isn't exactly a place where, well, you understand." David's jaw tightened. "No, I don't understand. Could you explain?" Linda leaned in slightly, lowering her voice though the condescension stayed. "This is a traditional congregation. People expect a certain kind of decorum. We don't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Angela stared at her, stunned. "Uncomfortable? For seeing a family sit in church?" Before Linda could respond, a few nearby parishioners began to take notice. Whispering rippled through the pews. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure if they should intervene. Linda, however, doubled down. She gestured toward the very back pews near the exit. "Please, just sit back there. It's better for everyone." David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a voice cut through the tension like a sharp bell. "Linda, step aside." Everyone turned. At the end of the aisle stood Father Michael, the priest of St. Matthew's. He was a tall, calm man in his early 60s, known for his measured sermons and quiet strength. But right now, his usually gentle eyes were locked on Linda with a firmness that made her shift uncomfortably. "Is there a problem here?" Father Michael asked, his voice even but carrying authority that echoed across the silent church. The room fell into a tense silence. The faint hum of the church organ, which had been playing softly moments before, faded as if even the music didn't dare intrude. All eyes were now on Linda and Father Michael. Linda straightened her back, trying to maintain the calm, superior smile she always wore when she felt cornered. "Oh, Father Michael," she said, her tone feigning innocence. "There's no problem, really. I was just helping this family find a more suitable place to sit." Father Michael walked slowly down the aisle, his dark robes brushing against the polished wooden floor. His calmness didn't waver, but his gaze was sharp. "And what exactly is unsuitable about the pew they chose?" Linda faltered slightly under his stare. "Well, you know how it is," she said lightly. "The front pews are generally for families who've been a part of St. Matthew's for generations. It's tradition. I thought they might feel more comfortable in the back." The Johnsons stood silently, their daughter Grace clutching Angela's hand a little tighter. David's jaw was clenched, his patience thinning with every word Linda spoke. Father Michael's eyes shifted to the Johnsons briefly, then back to Linda. Linda, every person who walks through those doors is equal in the eyes of this church. We don't measure someone's worth by how long they've been here or who their grandparents were. Linda's smile tightened. Of course, Father, but you must understand, some of the congregation might be unsettled by changes to the seating order. I'm just trying to maintain harmony. Harmony? Father Michael's voice grew firmer, carrying through the pews. Harmony does not come from exclusion. Harmony does not come from judgment. It comes from welcoming every soul who seeks peace here. A few parishioners nodded quietly, whispering in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably, realizing where this was going. Angela spoke up, her voice calm but strong. We only came here to worship, like everyone else. We didn't ask for special treatment, just a place to sit. Grace's small voice added softly, I just wanted to see the pretty windows from up close. Something in that innocent tone caused several people in the congregation to glance away, ashamed. Father Michael turned back to Linda. Step aside, he repeated. For the first time, Linda's confidence cracked. She hesitated, then moved to the side of the aisle, her posture stiff. Thank you, Father Michael said to the Johnsons, his tone softening instantly. Please, sit wherever you like. You are welcome here. David nodded, guiding his family to an empty pew near the front. Angela gave Father Michael a grateful look before sitting down. Grace smiled faintly, her eyes fixed on the colorful light streaming through the stained glass windows. Father Michael waited until they were seated, then turned back to the congregation. Let me remind everyone, he said, his voice steady but carrying a weight that silenced the whispers. This house does not belong to you or me or any one family. It belongs to God, and He does not care where you sit. He cares about what's in your heart. There was a moment of stillness. A few people lowered their heads in quiet reflection. Linda, still standing in the aisle, flushed red. She turned and walked briskly toward her usual seat, trying to regain her composure, but she could feel the stares. The silent judgment she was so used to directing at others now turned back on her. The service began, but the atmosphere was different. The Johnsons sat quietly, listening to the opening hymn. Father Michael's sermon that day was not the one he had originally planned. Instead, he spoke about the dangers of pride and the importance of hospitality. True faith, he said, his voice echoing through the church, is not proven by the hymns we sing or the pews we sit in. It is proven by how we treat the stranger among us, the newcomer, the one we might be tempted to judge. For in welcoming them, we welcome him. Angela felt tears sting her eyes. David held her hand under the pew. Grace rested her head gently against her mother's arm, comforted by Father Michael's words. Meanwhile, Linda sat rigid in her seat, staring straight ahead but hearing every word. She felt the burn of shame creeping in, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of indifference. After the service ended, a few kind parishioners came up to the Johnsons, offering warm smiles and introductions. Welcome to St. Matthew's, one older woman said kindly. I hope you'll come back next week. David smiled politely. Thank you, we'd like that. As they were leaving, Father Michael approached them personally. If you ever need anything, he said softly, know that this church is your home too. Angela nodded, her voice quiet. Thank you for standing up for us. Father Michael gave a humble smile. It's simply the right thing to do. Behind them, Linda lingered near the exit, unsure whether to leave quietly or say something. But the Johnsons didn't look her way. For the first time, she felt small. Outside, the sun was bright and the air felt lighter. The Johnsons walked hand in hand down the church steps, but they knew this wasn't over. In a small town like Crestwood, moments like this didn't just disappear. They echoed. And soon those echoes would spread beyond the church walls. By the time the Johnsons reached the church courtyard, whispers were already weaving through the small clusters of parishioners. Some offered polite smiles to the family, trying to distance themselves from what had just happened. Others stared silently, guilt flickering across their faces. A few even exchanged uneasy glances with Linda, who now lingered in the shadow of the church door, unsure what to do with herself. David adjusted his tie, still holding Angela's hand. Are you okay? He asked quietly. Angela nodded, though her voice carried a hint of fatigue. I'm fine, just disappointed, but at least Father Michael stepped in. Grace clutched her father's arm. Daddy, can we still come back next Sunday? David paused, glancing back at the grand stained glass windows. Yes, sweetheart, he said softly. We don't let people like that stop us. Meanwhile, Father Michael stepped outside, his presence immediately commanding quiet. He approached the Johnsons gently. "I know today wasn't the welcome you deserved," he said, "but I promise you, this church will always be open to you." David offered a faint smile. "Thank you, Father. It meant a lot that you spoke up," Angela added. "Not everyone would have. Some would have just looked away." Father Michael nodded solemnly. Looking away is how these things keep happening. As the Johnsons left the courtyard, several parishioners approached Linda. Some whispered words of disapproval, others simply shook their heads before walking away. Linda stood frozen, clutching her handbag tightly. "Linda," one elderly woman murmured with a frown, "that was shameful." Linda's mouth opened, but no words came. For the first time in a long time, she felt the sharp sting of being the subject of judgment. By that afternoon, the incident was the only topic in Crestwood's quiet neighborhoods. At Sunday lunch tables, families debated what had happened. Some defended Father Michael's actions, praising his courage. Others whispered excuses for Linda, suggesting maybe she just didn't know better. But things shifted when one of the younger parishioners uploaded a short video clip to social media. It wasn't much, just a few seconds of Linda blocking the Johnsons' path, her condescending tone audible enough. Then, Father Michael's calm but firm voice saying, "Step aside." Within hours, the clip circulated locally. The caption read, "This happened today at St. Matthew's Church. Still think this doesn't happen here?" Comments began flooding in. "Unbelievable. In church of all places?" Father Michael handled that perfectly. "Who is she? I've seen her do this at the community center too." By evening, the parish council had received multiple calls and emails about the situation. Some demanded an official statement from the church leadership. Others asked how long Linda's behavior had been ignored. Meanwhile, the Johnsons tried to settle into their new home. Angela sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone. "David," she said quietly, "look at this. People are already sharing the video." David took the phone, frowning. "I didn't even see anyone filming." Grace, sitting on the rug with her dolls, asked softly, "Are people mad at the lady?" Angela hesitated before answering. "They're upset with what she did. And they should be." Later that evening, Father Michael held an emergency meeting with the parish council. The room was filled with a mix of tension and shame. "This cannot be ignored," Father Michael said firmly. "We cannot call ourselves a house of God while allowing such behavior to go unchecked." One council member shifted nervously. "But Linda's family has been a major donor for years. She's influential." Father Michael's eyes hardened. "Influence does not excuse prejudice. If we protect her, we are complicit. This church must be better than that." The council fell silent. Across town, Linda sat in her pristine living room, staring blankly at the muted TV. Her phone buzzed with notifications, messages from friends asking what happened, subtle hints of judgment in their tone. Even her closest allies were distancing themselves, not wanting to be associated with her name, now circulating online. She replayed the moment in her head. She remembered the look on Grace's face, the quiet strength in Angela's voice, the way Father Michael's calm words had cut through her arrogance. For the first time in her life, Linda felt a flicker of doubt about herself, about who she had become. The next morning, the church inbox was overflowing. Messages of support for the Johnsons poured in from parishioners. Some offered apologies for not stepping in themselves. Others called for a clear response from Father Michael and the council. When Father Michael read them, he knew he couldn't let this fade quietly. He drafted a message that would go out to the entire congregation. St. Matthew's is and always will be a place of welcome. What occurred yesterday does not reflect our values. As a church, we stand firmly against prejudice in all its forms. Every family who enters these doors belongs here. He hit send. That evening, Angela received the message in her inbox. She showed it to David. "At least the church is taking a stand," she said softly. David nodded. "Yes, but this isn't just about the church. It's about the whole community." Grace piped up, her small voice hopeful. "Can we go back next Sunday?" Angela smiled faintly. "Yes, baby. We'll go back." But even as the Johnsons prepared to move forward, the echoes of that moment were spreading further than anyone expected. Because the clip didn't just stay in Crestwood. By midweek, it had been picked up by a regional news outlet, and soon it would go even further. By midweek, the story had left the quiet streets of Crestwood and taken on a life of its own. A regional news outlet ran a small segment titled, "Black Family Denied Seat in Church, Priest Intervenes." The accompanying video showed just a few seconds of the encounter. Linda standing stiffly, blocking the aisle, and Father Michael's steady voice saying, "Step aside." It wasn't the whole incident, but it was enough to spark outrage. On social media, the clip spread quickly. Comments flooded in from people who didn't even know where Crestwood was. Imagine turning someone away in a church of all places. Props to the priest for handling that with grace. This happens way more than people admit. Glad it's being called out. Meanwhile, Linda was spiraling. She'd hoped the story would stay contained within the congregation, maybe whispered about for a week before fading away. But now, strangers online knew her face. They dissected her actions, her tone, her entitled posture. Some even dug up old photos of her from community events, piecing together a narrative of her behavior over the years. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Some messages were from old friends distancing themselves. Others were harsher, people telling her exactly what they thought of her. Even her family began to feel the pressure. Her daughter came home from school in tears after classmates mentioned the viral video. "Mom," her daughter had said, "why did you do that?" Linda had no good answer. Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael was dealing with a different kind of attention. News outlets were now requesting interviews with him about his stance on inclusion. The parish office was flooded with emails, most supportive but some critical, accusing the church of bowing to political correctness. At a midweek prayer meeting, Father Michael addressed the small group of parishioners who gathered in the candlelit chapel. "We are called to love without condition," he said, "and love without condition means we do not measure who belongs here. Everyone belongs. If we forget that, we forget the very heart of our faith." Many nodded in agreement, but a few shifted uncomfortably. Change, even when necessary, always unsettled those who preferred the old ways. Meanwhile, the Johnsons tried to maintain some semblance of normal life. David went to work quietly, ignoring the curious stares from co-workers who had seen the video. Angela focused on settling Grace into her new school. But the emails and messages kept coming, some from strangers offering support, others sharing their own painful stories of exclusion. Angela sat at the kitchen table one evening, reading a message aloud to David. "I saw your story on the news. The same thing happened to my family years ago. We stopped going to church after that. Thank you for staying strong. You reminded me why it's worth trying again." David sighed. "It's sad how many people have been through the same thing." Grace, sitting nearby with her homework, looked up. "Mommy, are we going back this Sunday?" Angela smiled gently. "Yes, sweetheart, we're going back. We don't let people like her keep us away from what's right." Across town, Linda sat alone in her dining room. Her husband had stopped defending her, too exhausted from the endless calls from neighbors and reporters. She scrolled through her phone, reading yet another article about the incident. This one quoted Father Michael directly. "We will not allow prejudice to stand unchallenged within our church. Every soul who walks through our doors belongs." Linda put the phone down and stared at the flickering candle on her table. For years she had convinced herself she was just upholding tradition, but now she couldn't escape the truth. She had been using tradition as a shield for her own bias. The following Sunday, the Johnsons arrived at church again. This time, the atmosphere felt different. As they walked through the doors, several parishioners greeted them warmly. An older couple invited them to sit with them in the front pew. Grace beamed as she slid into the seat, finally able to see the stained glass windows up close without anyone stopping her. Father Michael began the service with a new message. "Last week, we were given a lesson, not from a sermon, but from an action. A family was turned away, but they came back today. They came back because faith is stronger than fear and dignity is stronger than hate. Let us remember this moment and promise each other, never again." The congregation applauded softly, some people wiping away quiet tears. Linda sat in the back, away from her usual place. She had forced herself to attend despite the shame, feeling the weight of the stares. She listened as Father Michael spoke about humility, forgiveness, and the courage to face our own failings. When the service ended, the Johnsons were surrounded by kind faces, parishioners who introduced themselves, apologized for what had happened, and welcomed them genuinely this time. As Angela walked Grace toward the door, she noticed Linda standing off to the side, clutching her handbag tightly. Their eyes met briefly. Linda opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she lowered her gaze. Angela turned back to her family. "Let's go home," she said softly. Outside the church, a local news van was parked discreetly on the curb. The story was still alive. It was moving beyond just one family and one congregation, becoming a conversation about how communities treated one another, even in sacred spaces. And soon, the ripple would spread further. By Monday morning, the clip of the incident at St. Matthew's had gone beyond regional news. It was now on national networks. Morning talk shows replayed the few seconds of Linda blocking the Johnsons' path, then Father Michael calmly stepping in with his firm, unwavering, "Step aside." The headlines were simple but powerful. Family denied seat in church sparks national discussion on inclusion. Priest's graceful intervention goes viral. Even houses of worship are not immune to bias. Angela sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, scrolling through her phone. Hundreds of comments had poured in overnight from strangers across the country. Some shared their own painful experiences, others offered encouragement. "This happened to my grandmother's family in the 70s. Heartbreaking to see it still happening today. Grace is so brave. I hope she never loses that innocence. Father Michael is the kind of leader we need more of." David walked in, adjusting his tie for work. "It's everywhere," Angela murmured, handing him the phone. David scanned the headlines. "I guess we shouldn't be surprised. People love stories like this, something that shows both the ugliness and the hope." Grace wandered into the kitchen with her backpack, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Are they still talking about church?" she asked. Angela smiled faintly. "Yes, sweetheart, but now they're talking about how Father Michael stood up for what's right." Meanwhile, at St. Matthew's, Father Michael was inundated with calls from journalists. He politely declined most interviews, insisting that the focus remain on the lesson, not on him. He gathered the parish council that afternoon to discuss what they could do moving forward. "This cannot just be a viral moment that fades away," he told them. "If this church is to mean anything, it must truly welcome everyone. That means real change, not just words." The council agreed to implement a new community outreach program, inviting families from all backgrounds to join and feel part of the congregation. Flyers would be distributed across Crestwood, and Father Michael planned to dedicate the next month of sermons to themes of humility, acceptance, and unity. As these plans unfolded, Linda was living in near isolation. She hadn't left her house in days. The few friends who still spoke to her urged her to publicly apologize. Her daughter avoided her, embarrassed by the attention at school. Her husband spent most of his time away, too ashamed to face neighbors asking uncomfortable questions. Linda sat on her couch, watching a national news segment about the incident. The camera showed the Johnsons entering the church the following Sunday, welcomed by smiling parishioners. Grace's face lit up when she saw the stained glass windows from the front pew. The clip ended with a brief interview of Angela saying, "We're grateful for those who stood with us. It's not about one person. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." Linda muted the TV, tears welling in her eyes. She replayed her own actions in her mind, her tone, her words, the way she had assumed ownership of a space that didn't belong to her. Shame clawed at her insides. That evening, Karen Hastings, still known to most as Linda in the circulating stories, sat at her dining table with a pen and paper. For the first time in years, she wrote a letter by hand. "To the Johnson family, I know you have every reason to ignore me, but I want to say I am deeply sorry for how I treated you. My words and actions were wrong. I let my prejudice speak louder than my humanity. I am not asking for forgiveness. I know that must be earned, if it can be earned at all, but I am trying to change. I am volunteering at the youth center and attending bias awareness classes. I am confronting who I've been. I hope one day our community can truly make room for every family. Linda Hastings." She sealed the letter but hesitated before sending it. Would they even read it? Would they believe her? Meanwhile, Angela received another email from the church, this time an invitation to join the new inclusion committee Father Michael was forming. She showed it to David. "They really want to make this right," she said. David nodded. "We should be part of it. Maybe it can stop this from happening to another family." That same evening, the regional news station ran a follow-up story about the church's response. The segment featured parishioners speaking about the incident. "I was sitting in the pew that day. I saw the whole thing," one man said. "It opened my eyes. I didn't realize how much silent bias exists, even in places that are supposed to be welcoming." Father Michael was interviewed briefly, saying, "Our faith teaches us that every person who walks through these doors belongs here. We failed that day, but we will do better." The clip ended with Grace holding her mother's hand outside the church, smiling shyly as she said, "I like the windows. They make me feel happy. By the end of the week, the incident had inspired a ripple effect. Other churches in nearby towns released statements affirming inclusivity. Some even began their own community discussions. Back in Crestwood, Linda finally stepped out of her house after nearly a week. She walked to the small mailbox on her porch and dropped in the handwritten letter, addressing it to the Johnsons' new home. She didn't know if they'd ever respond, but for the first time, she felt the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward accountability. And for the Johnsons, life was slowly returning to normal, though now they were woven into a larger story of quiet resilience and unexpected change. By the following week, the ripple effect of that single Sunday morning at St. Matthew's was evident everywhere in Crestwood. Conversations that had once been carefully avoided were now happening in grocery store aisles, at school pickup lines, even in the coffee shop on Main Street. People were asking themselves questions they'd never considered before, about their own assumptions, about the invisible lines drawn in their community. At the Johnsons' home, life was cautiously settling into a new rhythm. Grace seemed lighter after the second Sunday at church, where the congregation had made an effort to welcome them sincerely. She had even made a new friend, a little girl named Mia, who showed her the best view of the stained glass windows. Angela, however, still felt the weight of the stares when they were out in town. They weren't hostile stares anymore, but they carried curiosity, like people were still deciding how to feel. One afternoon, Angela checked the mail and found an envelope with neat, careful handwriting. No return address, just their family name. She opened it slowly at the kitchen counter. It was Linda's letter. Angela read it silently, her expression unreadable. David walked in as she reached the final line. "What's that?" he asked. Angela handed him the letter. "It's from her." David scanned it quickly. His jaw tightened slightly at first, but as he reached the end, he sighed. "So, she says she's sorry." Angela leaned on the counter. "She says she's volunteering, trying to learn, but I don't know if it's real or just for show." David placed the letter down. "People can change, but it takes more than words." Angela nodded. "Exactly, and I'm not ready to decide yet." Meanwhile, Linda was at the youth center again, stacking boxes of donated books in the small library. The staff watched her quietly. Some still doubted her motives, but she showed up every day. She didn't talk about the incident, she just worked, cleaning, organizing, helping the kids with activities. During snack time, a little boy sat beside her at the table. "Are you the lady from the video?" he asked innocently. Linda froze. "Yes," she admitted softly. "Did you say sorry?" the boy asked. Linda nodded. "I did, and I'm still saying sorry by trying to help now." The boy thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Okay, can you help me with this puzzle?" Linda blinked, a small lump forming in her throat. "Sure," she said quietly. Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael was preparing his next sermon. He had received dozens of letters from parishioners, most expressing support for the Johnsons and gratitude for his response. But a few letters carried a different tone, some subtle pushback, discomfort at how much attention the incident had brought to the church. He knew change wasn't easy, but as he looked out over the church during evening prayer, he saw more diversity in the pews than ever before, new faces who might never have felt welcome before, and he knew it was worth it. The church council had officially launched the Open Arms Initiative, a program aimed at making St. Matthew's a place where all families truly felt at home. Angela had agreed to serve on the committee alongside other parishioners eager to turn words into action. One evening, the Johnsons attended their first committee meeting. As they walked into the small meeting room, Angela was surprised to see how many people were there. Not just parishioners, but teachers, local coaches, and even a few business owners. Father Michael opened the meeting with a calm smile. "We are here because one incident revealed something bigger, but this will only matter if we keep going, if we make this a lasting change." Angela spoke up, her voice steady. "We didn't move here to be the center of attention. We just wanted a safe, welcoming place for our daughter. But if this can help other families feel that too, then it's worth it." David added, "What matters now is that people don't just talk, they act. It has to mean something." Across town, Linda watched the same committee meeting being streamed on the local access channel. She saw the Johnsons sitting there, speaking with grace and calm. She felt a pang of something unfamiliar, regret mixed with admiration. She picked up her phone and typed another message. "Angela, I understand if you don't trust me, but I'd like to help with the new initiatives at the church, even if it's behind the scenes. I know I've lost the right to ask for anything, but if you're willing, I want to contribute." She hesitated, then hit send. Angela received the message later that evening. She didn't reply right away. Instead, she placed the phone down and joined David and Grace on the couch, watching a family movie. Some things, she thought, didn't need immediate answers. The next Sunday, St. Matthew's was filled more than usual. Word had spread that the Johnsons would be speaking briefly after the service about their experience. The congregation listened intently as Angela shared their perspective, not with anger, but with quiet strength. "When we first walked through those doors," Angela said, "we felt unwelcome. But when Father Michael stepped in, and when so many of you chose to open your hearts instead of turning away, we saw hope. Let's make sure no one else has to feel like a stranger in a place meant for belonging." The congregation applauded softly. Father Michael nodded, pride in his eyes. Linda sat in the very back row that day. She didn't speak, didn't approach them. She just listened, absorbing every word, knowing her work to repair the damage was far from over. Outside the church, a reporter asked Angela for a comment. Angela simply said, "This isn't about one person. It's about what kind of community we choose to be." The clip would later air on national news again, this time framed as a story of reconciliation and growth. And slowly, the focus began to shift, not on the act of prejudice that started it all, but on the community learning how to heal and do better. The weeks following Angela's heartfelt speech at St. Matthew's marked a slow but steady transformation in Crestwood. The church, once known more for its tradition than its progress, was becoming a symbol of change. The Open Arms initiative took root quickly, bringing together volunteers from every corner of the town. Every Wednesday evening, the church hall now hosted community dinners where people who had never sat together shared meals, stories, and even prayers. Angela and David became regular faces at these gatherings. Grace loved helping set tables, her bright smile melting away lingering tension among the parishioners. One evening, as Angela helped serve soup to a group of elderly churchgoers, an older man approached her with a hesitant look. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, "I want you to know, I was there that day. I didn't say anything, and I should have. I'm sorry." Angela paused, meeting his eyes. She could see genuine remorse there. She offered a gentle nod. "Thank you for saying that. What matters now is how we move forward." Across town, Linda continued her quiet journey toward accountability. She showed up at the youth center every week, not to be seen, but simply to help. She read books to the children, cleaned up after activities, and learned to listen more than she spoke. One afternoon, the youth center director pulled her aside. "You've been consistent," he said. "That matters. But you know, this isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about becoming the kind of person who doesn't repeat the same harm." Linda nodded silently. For the first time, she didn't feel defensive. She understood. Meanwhile, Jamal was starting to feel more like himself again. The initial wave of attention from the incident had finally begun to settle, and he was back to focusing on basketball. But something inside him had shifted permanently. He was more aware now of the world, of how others saw him, and of the quiet strength he carried. One Saturday morning, Jamal stayed after practice to shoot extra free throws. As he picked up the ball, a young boy approached nervously. Jamal?" the boy asked. "I'm trying out for the team next week. I'm kinda scared I'm not good enough. Can you show me some tips?" Jamal smiled, handing the boy the ball. "Sure, let's start with your stance. It's all about balance." Naomi watched from the sidelines, her heart swelling with pride. He wasn't just playing basketball anymore, he was quietly becoming a leader. At home that evening, Naomi received an email from the State Council for Youth Programs. "We've seen your efforts with the Open Arms initiative. We'd love for you and Jamal to speak at our state conference about inclusion and community building. It could inspire similar programs in other towns." Naomi showed Jamal the email. He looked thoughtful. "Do you think people will really listen?" "They already are," Naomi said softly. "And every time you speak, someone who needs it will hear you." Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael was preparing a special service to mark the beginning of the church's new chapter. He invited families from surrounding towns to attend, hoping to extend the message of welcome even further. The day of the special service arrived with an unexpected guest. Linda entered the church quietly, choosing a seat in the back row as she had since the incident. But this time, she didn't just sit silently. When the service ended, She stood and walked toward the front where Angela and David were chatting with parishioners. "Angela," Linda said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know I've been trying. I've been volunteering, learning, and facing parts of myself I didn't want to see. I know it will take time, maybe forever, but I'm not giving up." Angela studied her for a long moment. David glanced at Linda, his expression neutral but not hostile. "I believe people can change," Angela said finally. "But it's not my forgiveness you should chase, it's your own ability to live differently moving forward." Linda nodded. "I understand. Thank you for at least hearing me." She didn't linger. She turned and left quietly, her steps slow but deliberate. Over the next few months, Crestwood became a model for neighboring communities. The Open Arms Initiative expanded into mentorship programs for youth, workshops for adults, and interfaith events that welcomed families from all backgrounds. The church hall, once quiet during the week, now buzzed with activity. Angela and David found their place in the community not as the family from the video, but as genuine members helping build something better. Grace thrived, making new friends and even joining the children's choir. Linda, meanwhile, continued her work at the youth center. She didn't seek public redemption anymore. She sought quiet change within herself. Little by little, the whispers around her name softened. People began to see her efforts, even if they didn't fully forget. One warm Sunday afternoon, Jamal and Naomi sat on the church steps after service, watching families mingle in the courtyard. "Mom," Jamal said, "do you think this would have all happened if we hadn't gone back that second Sunday?" Naomi smiled faintly. "Sometimes the hardest thing is showing up again after you've been hurt. But when you do, you give others a chance to be better too." Jamal nodded slowly, taking in her words. As they sat there, a group of kids ran past, laughing, their different voices and faces blending together without hesitation or barriers. And in that moment, it was clear. Something in Crestwood had truly changed. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. Several months had passed since that unforgettable Sunday at St. Matthew's. The initial buzz of the viral clip had faded from the headlines, but the changes it sparked were still unfolding quietly, steadily, like roots growing deep beneath the surface. The Open Arms Initiative had expanded beyond the church walls. Monthly community dialogues now took place at the Crestwood Library, drawing people from neighboring towns who wanted to replicate the model. Coaches from local schools began partnering with the church to host inclusive sports nights, ensuring every child felt welcome regardless of their background. Naomi found herself busier than ever. In addition to her coaching, she helped organize workshops on understanding bias and building stronger communities. She didn't want to be a figurehead for a cause, but she realized her voice carried weight, especially for the parents who felt powerless in the face of quiet discrimination. Jamal continued to balance school, basketball, and the occasional speaking engagement. At first, he had been reluctant to share his story, but with each small gathering, he began to see the impact. One evening, he spoke to a group of middle school students about resilience. Afterward, a young boy approached him shyly. "My dad doesn't like when I play basketball at the park with kids who don't look like us," the boy admitted softly. "But I like playing with them. You think that's okay?" Jamal crouched down so they were eye level. "It's more than okay. You keep playing with everyone. The court doesn't care about color, it just cares about heart." The boy smiled, and Jamal realized something profound. Sometimes the smallest conversations planted the biggest seeds. Meanwhile, Linda's quiet journey of accountability continued. She was still volunteering at the youth center, helping with after-school tutoring and weekend art projects. Slowly, the staff began to see her sincerity, not because she asked for validation, but because she showed up consistently, without seeking praise or attention. One Saturday morning, Linda was wiping down tables after an art class when the youth center director approached her. "You've been coming here every week," he said. "What made you decide to keep at it?" Linda paused. "Because I needed to face myself. I can't change what I did, but I can choose who I am now. I don't want to be the person from that video anymore." The director gave a small nod. "Change is hard, but showing up like this, it matters." Linda didn't respond. She didn't feel proud. She just felt human. Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael continued to guide the congregation toward a new chapter. More families of different backgrounds began attending services. The church bulletin board was filled with photos of new events, interfaith dinners, youth mentorship programs, and even community service days that brought people together beyond Sunday mornings. Angela had become a key member of the inclusion committee. She worked with parishioners to create a welcoming packet for new families, ensuring they never felt like outsiders. David helped organize family sports days at the church courtyard, quietly bonding with fathers from all walks of life. Grace, now a beloved part of the children's choir, sang each Sunday with joy, her clear voice filling the church with light. She had made many new friends, children who didn't care about who came from where, only that they were kind and fun to be around. One Sunday, after a particularly moving service, Angela noticed Linda sitting quietly in the back pew again. When the service ended, Linda didn't rush out. Instead, she approached the table where Angela was helping distribute flyers for the next Open Arms event. "I've been volunteering at the youth center," Linda said softly. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness, I just wanted you to know I'm still trying." Angela studied her face for a moment. She could see the weariness in Linda's eyes, the humility that hadn't been there before. Angela gave a simple nod. "Keep trying," she said. "That's all anyone can do." Linda nodded back, no longer expecting a warm embrace or quick absolution. She turned and left quietly, content to keep walking the long road she had chosen. Later that day, Naomi and Jamal were invited to a regional community conference where they shared the story of Crestwood. It wasn't about reliving the pain. It was about showing how a single act of courage and a single moment of accountability could transform an entire community. Jamal stood before the crowd, no longer nervous. "What happened to me could have just been another bad moment," he said. "But because people chose to speak up, it became a lesson. And now kids like me know they're not alone. That's what matters most." The audience applauded warmly. As they left the conference, Jamal looked at his mom. "Do you think all this will really last?" he asked. Naomi smiled faintly. "It will, if people keep choosing to do better, even when it's hard." And indeed, it seemed the choice to do better was spreading. Churches from other towns wrote letters asking for guidance on starting their own inclusion programs. Youth centers reached out to collaborate on events. Even schools invited Naomi and Jamal to speak about the importance of standing up for what's right. For the Johnsons, Crestwood was no longer just the place where it happened. It was becoming the place where things changed. And for Linda, though the whispers of her past would always follow her, she was slowly carving out a different future, one quiet act of service at a time. In the end, it wasn't a perfect story. There were no grand gestures or overnight miracles, but there was growth, there was learning, and most importantly, there was hope that what started as a painful moment could become a lasting reminder that true belonging is built by choice over and over again. Months passed, and what had begun as a single uncomfortable moment in a small-town church had become the spark for something far larger. Crestwood, once an unremarkable community, was now being recognized as a model for inclusion and reconciliation. The Open Arms initiative grew beyond the church's reach, connecting with schools, youth sports leagues, and even neighboring towns that wanted to learn how to create welcoming environments. Naomi found herself traveling more frequently, invited to speak at forums and conferences. She was careful, though. She didn't want her family's life to revolve around the incident forever. "We're not here to be the faces of this," she told organizers. "We're just here to make sure it means something real for others." Jamal, meanwhile, began focusing again on what had always mattered most to him: basketball. With the support of his coaches and community, his training schedule grew more intense. He started competing in regional tournaments, catching the attention of scouts. Yet even on the court, kids and parents occasionally recognized him. After one game, a fellow player approached him. "Hey, you're that kid from the church story, right?" he asked. Jamal sighed softly but nodded. The boy smiled. "I just wanted to say, my little sister saw you on TV and said she wants to be brave like you. So, thanks, man." Jamal blinked, unsure how to respond. Finally, he just smiled back. "Tell her she already is." Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael continued his work quietly but intentionally. The congregation had changed, not entirely, but noticeably. People who once sat in their own familiar pews now moved around, deliberately making space for newcomers. Fellowship gatherings were fuller than ever, filled with conversations that crossed cultural and generational lines. Angela had become a respected voice in the parish, helping lead new welcome programs for families who were visiting for the first time. She organized a community coffee once a month where people could meet without the formal structure of Sunday service. Grace often helped by greeting guests at the door, handing out little cards she had decorated herself. One Sunday after the service, a family from another town approached Angela. They were hesitant but smiling. "We saw your story on the news," the father said. "We stopped going to church years ago after something similar happened to us. But after seeing what you and your family did here, we decided to try again." "Thank you." Angela felt her throat tighten but managed a warm smile. "I'm glad you came. You're welcome here." Meanwhile, Linda's quiet redemption continued in the background. She never tried to return to the social circles she once dominated. Instead, she kept volunteering at the youth center and attending the community dinners, never making herself the center of attention. One evening, while cleaning up after an event at the youth center, Linda overheard two women talking about the changes in Crestwood. "It's amazing how one ugly moment turned into something so positive," one woman said. "Yeah," the other replied, "though I wonder if the woman who caused it really learned anything." Linda froze for a moment but didn't interrupt. She simply continued wiping down the tables. She didn't need them to know she was trying. She just needed to keep trying. A few days later, Linda received an email from Angela. "I got your message about wanting to help with the church initiatives. There's a new community meal happening next week. If you're serious, you can volunteer with us there. No speeches, no spotlight, just work. If you're willing." Linda stared at the message for a long moment. Then she replied simply, "I'll be there." The following week, Linda arrived early at the church hall. She quietly helped set tables and prepare food. Angela acknowledged her with a polite nod but didn't say much. They worked side by side, not as friends, but as two women both contributing to something bigger than themselves. That night, the meal was a success. Families from all over the community came together, talking, laughing, and sharing stories. Jamal even stopped by after practice, greeted warmly by kids who looked up to him. As the evening wound down, Father Michael stood before the crowd. "Look around you," he said. "This is what community looks like, not just sitting together in the same building, but truly seeing each other as equals. That's the lesson we're all still learning." After everyone left, Angela noticed Linda quietly gathering plates and stacking chairs. There was no pretense in her movements, no need for recognition. Just quiet effort. Later that night, Naomi sat on the porch with Jamal, the warm summer breeze carrying the faint sound of crickets. "Mom," Jamal said, spinning a basketball gently on his fingertips, "do you ever think about how it all started? Just one person telling us we didn't belong?" Naomi nodded. "I do, but I also think about how it ended, with so many people choosing to show that we do belong." Jamal smiled faintly. "Guess even the worst moments can make something good happen." Naomi looked at her son, proud of how far he'd come. "Exactly. It's what you do after the hurt that matters most." Far across town, Linda sat at her kitchen table in the quiet. For the first time in months, she felt a small sense of peace, not because she was forgiven, but because she was finally living differently. And in Crestwood, a new chapter had begun. Not perfect, not free of mistakes, but undeniably better than what came before. By the time autumn rolled into Crestwood, the town had undeniably shifted. The church bells still rang every Sunday morning, but the faces in the pews were different. There were more families who had once felt hesitant about attending, more diversity in the congregation than ever before. St. Matthew's was no longer just a place of worship. It had become a symbol of renewal for the entire community. The Open Arms initiative was now a permanent fixture. It had extended beyond the parish, inspiring partnerships with local schools, youth clubs, and even the Crestwood City Council. Community meals, mentorship programs, and dialogues about inclusion were now regular events. Angela had become an unofficial leader in these efforts. She was calm, approachable, and deeply respected for how she'd handled the ordeal. People sought her guidance not just about the church, but about how to navigate their own struggles with bias in workplaces, schools, and neighborhoods. David, though quieter, had also found his place. He spearheaded a youth sports day that encouraged kids from all backgrounds to play together. The event drew huge crowds, with laughter and cheers echoing across the town park. And Grace, sweet Grace, had blossomed in ways Angela hadn't expected. She was now a favorite in the children's choir, her clear voice leading the hymns. She no longer looked nervous when entering the church. Instead, she skipped down the aisle with her friends, her innocence intact. For Jamal, Life was beginning to feel normal again, though it would never be quite the same. Basketball was still his focus, but he carried an added sense of purpose. He joined a youth mentorship group, working with younger kids who faced similar insecurities. He never told them what to think. He just listened, reminding them they weren't alone. After one practice, Jamal sat on the bleachers tying his shoes when his coach approached. "You've got colleges asking about you," the coach said with a smile. "But more than that, you've become someone the younger kids look up to. You've handled all of this with more grace than most adults I know." Jamal smiled modestly. "I just did what I had to do." Across town, Linda's redemption journey continued quietly. She no longer hid from the community, but she didn't force herself into the spotlight either. She kept volunteering at the youth center, helping organize books and running simple craft projects. She never mentioned the incident unless someone brought it up, and when they did, she didn't deflect. She simply said, "I was wrong and I'm still learning." She also kept attending church, always sitting in the back, never making a show of her presence. Slowly, people began to soften, not fully forgiving, but acknowledging her efforts. One Sunday after the service, Linda stayed behind to help clean up. Angela was gathering leftover flyers when Linda approached. "I just wanted to thank you," Linda said quietly, "for letting me help at the community dinner last month. I know I'll never erase what happened, but being able to contribute means something." Angela studied her for a moment. There was no arrogance in Linda's eyes anymore. No trace of the entitlement she once wore like armor. Just humility. "It's not about erasing the past," Angela said. "It's about making sure it doesn't happen again. If you're really committed to that, then keep showing up." Linda nodded. "I will." Meanwhile, Father Michael had been invited to speak at a regional clergy conference about the incident. He stood before a room filled with priests, pastors, and community leaders from across the state. "What happened in our parish wasn't unique," he told them. "It happens everywhere, in different forms. But what matters is how we respond. Do we stay silent out of fear of discomfort, or do we choose courage, even in small, simple ways?" His words resonated deeply. Several churches reached out afterward, asking how they could start similar inclusion programs. As the season changed, the Johnsons were no longer seen as the family from the video. They were simply part of the Crestwood community. They hosted a small neighborhood barbecue one Saturday, inviting parishioners, new friends, and even some of the kids from the youth center. Linda came too, quietly helping serve food. She stayed mostly in the background, but when Grace handed her a plate of cookies with a shy smile, Linda felt something she hadn't in months. A glimmer of belonging. Fragile but real. Later that evening, as the guests left and the sky turned golden, Jamal sat on the porch steps with Naomi. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "I used to wish it never happened, that we could just have walked in that day and sat down without anyone stopping us." Naomi nodded slowly. "I wish that too. But if it hadn't happened, maybe none of this change would have started." Jamal looked out at the quiet street where neighbors were waving goodnight to each other. "I guess sometimes the bad things force people to become better." Naomi smiled softly. "Yes, it's what we choose to do after the bad things that defines who we are." In the following weeks, the church published a small booklet titled "A Place for Everyone: Lessons from Crestwood." It was distributed to churches and community centers statewide. The story of that single Sunday morning, once a painful moment of exclusion, was now inspiring people far beyond the little town. For Jamal, for Angela, and for David, life moved forward. And for Linda, though her road to redemption was long, she kept walking it one quiet step at a time. Crestwood was no longer the same place it had been. It wasn't perfect, but it was proof that even the smallest act of courage, a priest saying, "Step aside," a family choosing to return despite hurt, a community choosing to listen, could create lasting change. Winter arrived in Crestwood with soft flakes of snow dusting the rooftops and quiet streets. Despite the cold, the community felt warmer than it had in years. The ripples from that Sunday at St. Matthew's continued to grow, weaving into the fabric of everyday life. The Open Arms Initiative had expanded into a formal nonprofit organization. What began as a simple church committee was now hosting events in nearby towns, offering workshops for schools and community leaders on inclusion and empathy. Naomi, though careful not to overextend herself, agreed to serve as an advisor. Jamal was thriving in basketball. He'd been invited to a state-level youth tournament, and scouts were beginning to take notice. But even as his athletic achievements grew, People still occasionally recognized him for the church incident. At first it bothered him, but over time he learned to carry it with quiet strength. One day after practice, a local reporter caught him as he was leaving the gym. "Jamal," the reporter asked, "you've gone from being known as the boy in the church video to a rising basketball star. How do you balance it all?" Jamal paused thoughtfully. "I don't think about being known," he said. "I just focus on what I can control: my game, my school, how I treat people. What happened that day doesn't define me, but it taught me something important. Even small actions can change more than you think." The clip of that short interview went online and resonated deeply, especially with young athletes. Comments poured in. "This kid's mindset is amazing. He's right. You can't control what happens to you, only how you respond. This is the kind of role model our kids need." Meanwhile, Linda was slowly, steadily rebuilding her life in the background. She no longer sought validation, but remained committed to her quiet acts of service. She'd become a regular volunteer at the youth center and even started attending the Open Arms Initiative's community dinners, not as a guest of honor, but simply as someone willing to help set tables and wash dishes afterward. One evening, as Linda packed up supplies at the youth center, a young volunteer approached her. "You're Linda, right?" Linda froze slightly but nodded. The young woman smiled gently. "I was at the summit months ago. I heard you speak that day. I just wanted to say, it mattered that you owned your mistake. Not everyone does that." Linda blinked, surprised. "Thank you," she said quietly. It wasn't absolution, but it was a small reminder that even accountability could plant new seeds. Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael continued to guide the congregation through its transformation. The church had become a hub of activity. The Christmas service that year was the most diverse gathering in its history. Families from different backgrounds filled the pews, their voices blending harmoniously in carols. Angela stood with Grace near the front, smiling as she watched her daughter sing. Grace had come a long way since that first nervous Sunday morning. She now greeted new kids with ease, showing them where to sit, telling them which windows had the prettiest colors when the light hit just right. After the service, Father Michael gathered the congregation. "This past year has taught us a difficult but important lesson," he said. "It showed us that even in places meant for love and peace, we can falter. But it also showed us that change is possible when we choose courage, humility, and grace. Let us never forget that lesson." The crowd applauded softly, many nodding in agreement. Later that evening, Naomi and David hosted a small gathering at their home. Neighbors, friends from the church, and even some of the youth center volunteers came by. The house was warm with laughter and conversation. As Naomi set out plates of food, Angela received a notification on her phone. She opened it and read aloud. "State legislature recognizes Crestwood's Open Arms Initiative as a model for community inclusion. Plans to expand statewide." David smiled. "Looks like what started here is going further than we ever imagined." Naomi nodded. "It's proof that even the smallest place can spark something big." Across town, Linda sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea. She saw the same article online and felt a mix of emotions: regret for what had happened, but also a strange quiet relief that something better had come from it. She didn't feel pride. She didn't deserve it. But she felt a renewed determination to keep walking the difficult path she'd chosen. A week later, the Johnsons attended a regional conference about community rebuilding, where Naomi was invited to speak. Jamal didn't plan to talk, but when a young boy asked him directly how he stayed calm that day in the church, he took the microphone and answered honestly. "I stayed calm because I wanted to show my little sister it's always better to respond with dignity, and because I knew my mom would have my back. That's all it was. I didn't want anger to win." The room went silent for a moment before erupting into applause. Naomi smiled at her son. "See," she whispered, "your voice matters more than you realize." As the conference wrapped up, people left inspired, not just by the Johnsons' resilience, but by the proof that even a painful moment could be transformed into lasting change. Back in Crestwood, life moved on. The snow melted, giving way to spring. The church continued to thrive. The youth center grew busier, and the small acts of kindness, courage, and humility continued to ripple outward. Crestwood wasn't perfect, but it was better. And for those who had lived through the transformation, it was proof that even in the most unexpected places, hope could take root. Spring in Crestwood brought a fresh sense of renewal. The trees along Main Street bloomed with delicate pink flowers, and the air felt lighter, as though the town had collectively exhaled after months of quiet change. But the work that began with a single incident was far from finished. Naomi spent her mornings at the church and afternoons at the youth center where she had started mentoring young parents. She guided them on how to advocate for their children in schools and community spaces. Her calm demeanor and thoughtful words made her a trusted figure, not only within the congregation but in the entire town. Jamal, now balancing his last year of high school with regional basketball tournaments, was thriving both on and off the court. College recruiters were sending letters, and he'd already earned a spot on the shortlist for an elite training camp that summer. But Jamal never let the recognition go to his head. One day after practice, as he packed his gym bag, a younger player came over nervously. "Jamal," the boy said, "can I ask you something? My family just moved here, and I'm worried about how people are going to treat us. I heard about what happened to you before." Jamal looked at him and smiled faintly. "Yeah, it wasn't easy. But things are better now, and you won't be alone. If anyone ever makes you feel like you don't belong, come talk to me, all right?" The boy nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. Meanwhile, Angela was deep into organizing the next Open Arms Community Day. What had started as a single outreach event had grown into a quarterly gathering that brought together churches, schools, and community groups. Each event was filled with food, games for kids, and open discussions about inclusion. David was quietly involved too, helping coordinate logistics and inviting local businesses to sponsor the events. Even those who had been skeptical at first were now supporting the efforts, realizing they benefited the entire community. Linda continued her quiet redemption without seeking acknowledgement. She still volunteered at the youth center and had started helping with the community meals at St. Matthew's. She never positioned herself as someone who deserved trust, but people noticed her persistence. One Sunday after service, Grace approached Linda with a small, hesitant smile. "Miss Linda?" she said softly. Linda knelt down to Grace's height. "Yes?" Grace handed her a handmade card. "I made extras for everyone who helps at church. Thank you for helping." Linda's breath caught for a moment. She took the card gently, her voice almost a whisper. "Thank you, Grace. That means more than you know." It was a small gesture, but it felt like the first fragile bridge between the past and a better future. Father Michael watched these changes quietly, grateful but realistic. He knew the work of healing a community never truly ended. His sermons now often spoke of the power of small actions, how even the simplest kindness could shift the course of someone's life. One sunny afternoon, a reporter visited Crestwood to do a follow-up story for a national outlet. He interviewed Naomi outside the youth center. "Naomi," the reporter asked, "looking back, do you feel this community has really changed?" Naomi thought carefully before answering. "Change isn't a single moment, it's a choice you keep making. What happened here started with pain, but it led to conversations that needed to happen. And as long as people keep choosing to listen, to welcome, and to learn, then yes, I think we've truly changed." The story aired that evening, highlighting Crestwood as a model for how a small community could face its flaws and grow stronger. It showed clips of Jamal mentoring kids on the basketball court, Angela organizing events, and Linda quietly serving food at the community dinners. Across town, Linda watched the segment on her modest TV. Seeing herself in the background, unnoticed by most viewers, felt strange. But this time, it wasn't shame she felt. It was quiet acceptance of the work still ahead of her. Weeks later, the Johnsons received an unexpected letter from a church in another state. "We saw what your family in St. Matthew's did in Crestwood. It inspired us to examine how we welcome people in our own congregation. Thank you for showing us what real community can look like." Angela read the letter aloud to David, her eyes soft with emotion. "See, it really is spreading," she said. Meanwhile, Jamal prepared for his final home game of the season. The entire community showed up. Parishioners, neighbors, even kids from the youth center. The gym was packed, not just with fans of the game, but with people who had come to support the boy who had helped change their town. When the game ended, Jamal's team won by a slim margin. As the crowd cheered, Jamal glanced into the stands and saw Naomi and Angela smiling proudly. And in the very back row, he noticed Linda, clapping quietly, her expression filled with something that looked like genuine humility. After the game, Father Michael approached Jamal. "You know," he said, "what happened that day in church didn't define you. It revealed you. And what you've done since then? That's the true legacy." Jamal nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. "I just hope it keeps helping people." Later that night, the Johnsons sat on their porch as the stars dotted the sky. Grace leaned against Angela, humming one of her choir songs. David sipped his tea, looking peaceful. Naomi broke the silence. It's strange, isn't it? How one ugly moment can lead to something beautiful if people choose to do the work. David smiled. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that open the right doors. Jamal looked out into the quiet night. And sometimes the people who try to keep you out are the ones who end up teaching the biggest lessons. The family sat together in silence, knowing the journey wasn't over, but feeling comfort in how far they and Crestwood had come. Because what began as a single moment of exclusion had become a lasting testament to resilience, forgiveness, and the power of community. Years passed, and the story that once dominated headlines faded into the background of everyday life. But its impact lingered quietly, shaping Crestwood into a place forever changed. The Open Arms initiative grew into a regional network. What began as a small-town project now partnered with churches, schools, and youth centers in 3 neighboring counties. Its mission was simple but powerful, to ensure no one felt unwelcome in spaces meant for community. Naomi remained on the advisory board, guiding the program without seeking recognition. Jamal's life moved forward with purpose. He earned a basketball scholarship to a state university, but even as his career advanced, he continued mentoring kids back home. Every school break, he returned to Crestwood, holding free clinics at the youth center. Parents trusted him not just as an athlete, but as someone who had lived through something hard and turned it into strength. One summer afternoon, Jamal stood in the same gym where he once faced whispers and assumptions. Now, the bleachers were filled with kids eager to learn. He bounced a ball on the polished floor and smiled. "You don't just play for yourself," he told them. "You play to show others what's possible, and you belong on this court, always." The kids cheered, and Naomi watched from the sidelines, pride warming her heart. Angela, now a well-known community organizer, balanced her work with family life. She helped create an annual Crestwood Community Festival that celebrated diversity and unity. Every year, people from all over the region came to enjoy music, food, and storytelling from different cultures. Grace was growing into a confident young girl. She still sang in the church choir, but now she also led the welcoming committee for new kids, guiding them with the same kindness she wished she'd felt that first Sunday. Meanwhile, Linda's journey remained one of quiet humility. She never reclaimed her old social standing, nor did she want to. She continued volunteering, quietly donating to programs that supported youth and families. Over time, she became a familiar, unassuming presence at community events. One day at the youth center, while packing boxes of school supplies for families, Linda overheard 2 volunteers talking. "Remember when this center barely had any help? Now look at it," one said. "Yeah," the other replied. All because one story showed everyone how much work there was to do. Linda smiled faintly to herself. She didn't need anyone to know she was part of that story. She just needed to keep showing up. Father Michael had grown older, but his wisdom remained sharp. He often reflected on how that single Sunday became a turning point for St. Matthew's. During one service, he spoke of it without naming names. "Sometimes the lesson isn't in the sermon," he said, his voice echoing softly through the pews. "Sometimes it's in the moments we wish hadn't happened, moments that reveal who we are and who we can become if we choose humility and grace." The congregation nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. One autumn evening, Crestwood hosted its largest community event yet. Families from across the region filled the town square, music playing as kids ran between booths. The Open Arms initiative was celebrating its 5th year, and people came to honor how far the community had come. Naomi and Angela were on stage, thanking volunteers and partners. David mingled with old and new friends, while Grace and her friends handed out pamphlets about youth programs. Jamal arrived late, fresh from a college practice. The crowd welcomed him with warm applause. He stepped up to the microphone, his tall frame and confident smile showing how much he'd grown. "I used to think this town would always remember me as the boy from that video," Jamal began. "But now I see it's not about that moment. It's about everything we chose to do after it. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because a community decides to be better together." The audience erupted in applause, some standing as Jamal stepped down. In the back of the crowd, Linda watched silently. She wasn't part of the ceremony, and she didn't need to be. Seeing the community thriving was enough. She felt a strange sense of peace and understanding that while she couldn't undo the past, she had helped in some small way to build a better future through her quiet acts of service. Later that night, as the event wound down, Naomi and Jamal sat on a bench overlooking the town square. Lights twinkled in the trees, and laughter echoed around them. "Feels different now, doesn't it?" Naomi said softly. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, it feels like it was worth it, even the hard parts." Naomi smiled. "Because the hard parts taught everyone what really matters." As they sat in the gentle glow of the festival lights, Naomi glanced across the square and saw Linda helping stack chairs. Their eyes met briefly. Linda gave a small, respectful nod before turning back to her work. Naomi returned the nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was closure, a quiet understanding that they had both done what they could to move forward. Crestwood would never forget what happened, but it no longer defined the town. Instead, it defined what the community became afterward, a place where people learned, grew, and chose to do better. And that, in the end, was the truest form of belonging. Years later, Crestwood had become known as more than just a quiet suburban town. It was now recognized as a place where a difficult lesson had sparked lasting change. Articles in regional papers called it the town that chose to welcome. Conferences invited representatives from Crestwood to speak about how communities could rebuild trust and foster true inclusion. Naomi had stepped into a quiet but influential role. She didn't seek the spotlight, but her calm presence at forums and panels made her a respected voice. She often reminded people that what happened in Crestwood wasn't about one family or one person. It was about what a community chose to do afterward. "Change is not a single act," she would say. "It's a commitment you renew every day." Angela continued her work with the Open Arms Initiative, which had now expanded into neighboring counties. She organized family outreach programs, bridging gaps between different communities. David often helped with logistics, his practical nature keeping events running smoothly. Grace, now a teenager, was a bright example of what could grow from a painful beginning. She led the youth choir and volunteered at the community dinners, greeting newcomers with the same warmth she once longed for. Jamal had graduated college and was pursuing a career in sports management. Though his basketball journey didn't lead to the professional leagues, it led him to something even more meaningful: mentorship. He returned to Crestwood often, running free clinics for kids who reminded him of himself years ago. At one of those clinics, a boy around 10 years old tugged on Jamal's sleeve after practice. "My dad said we're moving here," the boy said shyly. "He was worried we wouldn't fit in, but my mom told him about you and she said it's different here now." Jamal smiled warmly. "It is. You'll like it here. And if you ever feel like you don't belong, you come find me, okay?" The boy nodded, relief on his face. Meanwhile, Linda's life had taken on a quieter rhythm. She was no longer known as the woman from the video in a scandalous way. Instead, she became a symbol of accountability for those who were willing to face their mistakes. She never tried to erase what happened, but she didn't hide either. She still volunteered at the youth center and at church events. Slowly, people began to see her not as the person who had caused pain, but as someone who chose to learn from it. A few even began to talk to her again, cautiously at first, then more openly as time passed. One evening after a community dinner, Linda found herself stacking chairs beside Angela. For a moment, there was silence between them. "You've kept showing up," Angela said quietly, almost as an observation rather than a question. Linda nodded. "It's the least I can do. I don't expect forgiveness, I just don't want to stop trying." Angela looked at her thoughtfully. "Sometimes trying is the first real step toward change." Linda didn't reply. She just continued her work, feeling a quiet sense of purpose she hadn't known before. Father Michael, now older and moving a bit slower, continued to lead St. Matthew's with the same quiet strength he had shown that day years ago. His sermons were filled with stories of growth, humility, and redemption. "Sometimes," he said during a packed Sunday service, "the most painful moments can become the seeds of our greatest lessons. But only if we are willing to water them with humility and grace." The congregation nodded, many of them remembering that pivotal moment years ago. Crestwood's reputation had reached beyond the county. Schools from other districts sent delegations to learn about the programs the town had built. Even local businesses had adopted inclusive hiring practices inspired by the community's journey. One spring afternoon, Naomi sat on her porch, sipping tea as she read a letter. It was from a pastor in another state who had heard Crestwood's story. "Your town's journey gave us the courage to confront our own issues. We started our own inclusion program, and it's already changing lives. Thank you for proving that small communities can make a big difference." Naomi folded the letter with a quiet smile. She looked across the street at the youth center where kids were running and laughing, their voices carrying on the breeze. Later that evening, the town square hosted another community event. Families from different backgrounds filled the space with chatter and laughter. Jamal, home for the weekend, was surrounded by kids eager to hear his stories from college. Grace helped decorate the tables with colorful flowers, humming softly as she worked. Linda was there too, helping serve food. She didn't stand apart anymore, though she still moved quietly. A few people even thanked her for helping. She didn't expect it, but it warmed her nonetheless. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Father Michael stepped onto the small stage in the square. He looked out at the crowd. A sea of faces, all different, all together. "Years ago," he said, "we were faced with a moment that revealed the cracks in our community. But we chose to mend them, not with anger, but with action. Tonight, look around you. This is what choosing love looks like." The crowd applauded, some holding hands, others wiping away quiet tears. Naomi glanced at Jamal, who smiled faintly. "It really did change everything, didn't it?" he said. "Yes," Naomi replied softly. "It changed us. And it keeps changing others, even now." And as the lights of the town square twinkled under the evening sky, Crestwood stood as a testament to what was possible when a community chose growth over silence and redemption over pride. Years later, Crestwood was no longer just the small town where a painful moment had gone viral. It had become a quiet beacon of how a community could confront its flaws and choose a better path. People who visited the town would often comment on its warm atmosphere, the way strangers greeted one another in the streets, the way the church doors always seemed open, the laughter of children spilling from the youth center. Naomi had gracefully stepped into a mentorship role for other communities seeking to replicate Crestwood's journey. She traveled occasionally to speak at conferences but always came home grounded. She preferred spending time with the families in her own neighborhood, quietly guiding them when needed. One afternoon, she sat in her cozy living room reading a letter she'd just received. It was from a pastor in another state who had seen her speak years earlier. "We started an inclusion program in our church after hearing Crestwood's story. A family who left our congregation years ago has now returned. Thank you for showing us what true leadership looks like." Naomi folded the letter, a small smile playing on her lips. She never set out to be a leader in this way. It simply happened because she refused to stay silent when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Jamal's life had taken a path full of meaning. He had graduated from college, earned a degree in sports management, and launched a nonprofit that created safe spaces for kids to play and learn teamwork. Though he lived in the city now, he returned to Crestwood often to run youth clinics. One sunny afternoon, Jamal held a basketball camp at the very same gym where he used to train. Kids from different towns packed the court, laughing and competing with boundless energy. After the camp, a young girl came up to him clutching her basketball. "Coach Jamal," she said shyly, "my brother said you're the reason our new community center got built. Is that true?" Jamal crouched down, smiling. "I'm just part of it. A lot of people work together to make it happen. But you know what's most important?" The girl tilted her head. "What?" "That you take care of it, and that you make sure everyone feels like they belong here," Jamal said. "That's how it keeps growing." The girl nodded solemnly, like she understood more than her years suggested. Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael, now retired but still loved by the community, attended services as a parishioner. He watched as the church he had once shepherded continued to thrive under new leadership. The diversity in the pews had grown even more, a living testament to the choices made all those years ago. Angela remained deeply involved in the Open Arms initiative, which was now fully independent and operated in multiple towns. She coordinated annual Days of Unity, where communities gathered for music, food, and dialogue. David continued to support quietly, content to help wherever needed. Grace, now a young adult, was studying community development at university. She often told people that her path started the day she realized how fragile belonging could feel, and how powerful it was to create it for others. And then there was Linda. She never left Crestwood, though she could have easily disappeared into another town. She stayed because leaving felt like running from the lesson she had to keep learning. Her life was simple now. She worked at a small nonprofit that helped connect families to community resources. She volunteered at the youth center every week without fail. She still attended church, sitting in the back quietly, no longer the woman who needed control over the pews. One Sunday after service, Linda was approached by a young mother she'd never met before. "Are you Linda?" the woman asked cautiously. "Yes," Linda said, her voice calm. "I just wanted you to know," the mother said softly. "I heard your story. I moved here because of what this community became. I guess even mistakes can lead to good if people are willing to change." Linda blinked, her eyes misting slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. She didn't feel absolved and she didn't need to. What mattered was that she kept showing up, quietly contributing to the community she had once hurt. That summer, Crestwood held its largest community day of unity yet. The town square was filled with people, old residents, new families, kids of every background running and playing together. Naomi and Angela worked the welcome tent. Jamal ran a three-point contest for the kids. Grace helped coordinate performances on the main stage. As the sun began to set, the mayor took the stage to address the crowd. "This town wasn't always like this," the mayor said. "It took one hard moment to show us who we were. But more importantly, it showed us who we could become." Today, Crestwood isn't just a community. It's an example of what happens when people choose to listen, to learn, and to grow together. The crowd erupted in applause. Naomi glanced around the square, spotting Linda in the back, helping distribute water bottles to kids. Their eyes met briefly, and Naomi gave a small nod. Linda returned it quietly before turning back to her task. Later that evening, Jamal sat on a bench overlooking the square as the festival lights twinkled. Naomi joined him, the soft hum of music still playing in the background. "Hard to believe how far it's come," Jamal said softly. Naomi smiled. "It started with one moment of exclusion, but it turned into years of inclusion. That's the real legacy." Jamal looked thoughtful. "So even the worst day can plant the seeds for something good, if you choose to water it." Naomi placed a hand on his shoulder. "Exactly." As the stars appeared above the quiet town, Crestwood stood not as a perfect place, but as proof that healing and growth were possible, if people had the courage to face the truth and the humility to change. What began with a cruel whisper of "you don't belong" had become a chorus of voices saying, "You are welcome here." Several more years passed, and the story of Crestwood had become something of a quiet legend, retold in classrooms, discussed in leadership workshops, and shared in community-building seminars far beyond the town's borders. It was no longer just the incident at the church, it was remembered as the turning point that changed a town. Naomi, now gracefully older, continued her work in a more advisory role. She wasn't constantly on the road like before, but when invited, she'd still speak at universities and community conferences. She always gave the same humble reminder. It wasn't about me, it wasn't about one priest or one family. It was about an entire community choosing to be better, even when it was uncomfortable. She preferred spending most of her time in Crestwood, walking through the bustling community center or sitting quietly in the church courtyard, greeting familiar faces who still thanked her for sparking change. Jamal's nonprofit, Belong on the Court, had expanded into multiple cities. It combined basketball clinics with mentorship programs, teaching kids not just the game, but the values of teamwork, respect, and perseverance. His name was known among youth programs across the state, but he never forgot where it all began. Every summer, Jamal returned to Crestwood for the annual Community Day of Unity. He always ran the kids' basketball clinic in the same gym where he used to train alone in the early mornings. The walls now had murals painted by local youth, bright colors depicting people of all races and ages holding hands under a banner that read, "Everyone belongs here." Angela remained the steady heart of the local initiatives. She organized food drives, inclusion seminars, and family nights at the church. David, now semi-retired, quietly supported her efforts, always the calm anchor in the family. Grace, now a college student studying social work, often came home to help run the children's choir during holidays. One spring afternoon, as Naomi helped prepare for a youth mentorship event, a young woman approached her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Johnson, you don't know me, but I grew up hearing about what your family did here," she said. "My parents told me that because of you, they felt safe to bring us back to church after they left years ago. Thank you for making this place different." Naomi smiled gently, touched as always by the quiet ways the story lived on. Meanwhile, Linda's life had transformed completely, though she remained in the background. She had sold her old home and moved into a modest apartment near the youth center, where she volunteered full-time. She had also completed training in community outreach and occasionally gave workshops, not about her past, but about recognizing bias and building empathy. She never made her story the center of those workshops. Instead, she focused on the lesson. It's not enough to think you're a good person. You have to act like one every day, especially when it's hard. Her quiet consistency slowly earned her a new kind of respect. Not the performative kind she used to crave, but a genuine acknowledgement of her effort to change. One afternoon, Linda was helping at the community center when Grace, now visiting from college, walked in to volunteer. Grace recognized her instantly. "Hi, Miss Linda," Grace said softly, with a smile that was both kind and measured. Linda paused, then smiled back. "Hello, Grace. It's good to see you doing so well." Grace nodded. "Thank you for helping here. The kids love having extra hands." Linda felt a quiet sense of peace. That small exchange was more meaningful than any public apology could ever be. At St. Matthew's, the annual anniversary of the Open Arms Initiative was marked with a special service. Father Michael, now officially retired but still beloved, sat in the front row as the new priest spoke about Crestwood's legacy. "This church once faced a moment that could have divided it," the young priest said, "but instead it became a place where healing began. And it continues to remind us all that faith without action is hollow. Love without welcome is incomplete." After the service, families gathered in the church courtyard, now filled with blooming flowers and benches donated by community members over the years. Naomi sat with Jamal, watching children play tag under the warm sun. "Mom," Jamal said quietly, "do you think people still remember exactly what happened that day?" Naomi thought for a moment. "Maybe not every detail, but they remember the feeling. They remember how it changed things. And that's what matters." Jamal nodded. "I guess that's better than being remembered for just the hurt." As the event wound down, the mayor took the stage in the courtyard to share news with the crowd. "Today, Crestwood is being recognized statewide for its community building programs," the mayor announced. "Our little town has inspired dozens of others to take steps toward inclusion and understanding. And it all began with the courage of a few individuals who refused to stay silent." The crowd clapped warmly. Jamal looked over at Naomi and Angela, a soft smile on his face. Later that evening, as the town square lights twinkled, Naomi took a quiet walk around the youth center. She stopped to look at a plaque mounted near the entrance. It read, "In honor of those who turned a moment of division into a legacy of unity, Crestwood will always remember." Naomi stood there for a long moment, reflecting on how far they had all come. She knew the journey of change never truly ended, but she also knew the seeds they planted would continue to grow long after they were gone. Across the square, Linda was helping stack chairs after the event. She caught Naomi's eye and gave her a small, respectful nod before returning to her work. Naomi nodded back. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was understanding. And as the night settled over Crestwood, it was clear that what began as one painful Sunday morning had grown into a living testament that even the smallest acts of courage could change the course of an entire community. And beyond. A decade had passed since that fateful Sunday morning at St. Matthew's. Crestwood had grown in quiet, meaningful ways, and what started as a painful incident was now remembered as the catalyst for a generational shift in values. The Open Arms Initiative had blossomed into a full-fledged statewide network. It provided educational programs, diversity training, and youth mentorship projects in towns that had never even considered such conversations before. The nonprofit now had its own dedicated center in Crestwood, a bright, welcoming building filled with murals created by local children depicting unity and belonging. Naomi had stepped away from public speaking by then, but her influence lingered. She was often invited as an honorary guest at events celebrating community progress. She chose to stay close to home, enjoying her garden and the simple peace she had earned after years of service. Angela still ran the local branch of the initiative, but now she trained new leaders to take her place. David had fully retired and spent his days supporting Angela's work, helping organize events and maintaining the community spaces they'd helped create. Grace had graduated from university and returned to Crestwood as a social worker. Her specialty was working with families and children who felt marginalized. She often told people that her life's work had been inspired by something she experienced as a child in that very church. Jamal's nonprofit had grown beyond what he had ever imagined. Belong on the Court now operated in multiple states, hosting not just sports clinics, but leadership programs for young athletes. He traveled often, but always made time to return to Crestwood for the annual Community Day of Unity. One summer afternoon, Jamal stood at the new community center, surrounded by kids dribbling basketballs and laughing. He gave them the same speech he always did. "You don't have to be the best player," he told them. You just have to be the kind of person who makes others feel like they belong here. That's what makes a real team." The kids clapped and Jamal smiled, seeing himself in their eager faces. Meanwhile, Linda's life had taken on a steady, humble rhythm. She never left Crestwood, even though she easily could have disappeared elsewhere. She continued volunteering at the youth center and quietly funding scholarships for local kids. She attended the church every Sunday, always sitting in the back. She never expected forgiveness, but over the years, people began to see her differently. Not as the woman from the video, but as someone who had faced her flaws and chosen a different path. One day after a community dinner, Grace, now an adult, approached Linda. "You've kept coming all these years," Grace said softly. Linda nodded. "Because it matters, and because I don't ever want to be that person again." Grace studied her for a moment, then offered a faint smile. "I believe people can change if they want to." Linda smiled back. "So do I." Back at St. Matthew's, Father Michael's successor continued the legacy he had started. The church was now a vibrant, inclusive space where families of all backgrounds felt at home. Every year, on the anniversary of the Open Arms Initiative, the church hosted a special service celebrating community growth. During one such service, the new priest spoke of the history. "Years ago, this church faced a moment of division, but instead of letting it break us, we chose to rebuild stronger. What you see today, these families, this unity, is proof that even the hardest moments can lead to grace." In the front pew, Naomi and Angela sat side by side, holding hands. Jamal stood near the back with a group of kids from his program, and Grace helped lead the choir. In the far corner, Linda quietly placed fresh flowers near the altar before slipping back into her seat. After the service, the community gathered outside in the courtyard, which now had a commemorative plaque. "In honor of those who turned exclusion into unity, pain into purpose, and silence into courage, Crestwood will always remember." Visitors from other towns stopped to read the plaque, often asking locals about the story behind it. They were told not just about the incident, but about what happened after, how the town chose action over apathy. Later that evening, Naomi sat on her porch, looking out at the quiet street. Jamal joined her, holding a cup of tea. "Mom," he said softly, "do you think people in other places are doing what we did here?" Naomi smiled gently. "Yes, because when people hear this story, they see that change is possible, and once you know it's possible, you can't unsee it." Jamal nodded, looking thoughtful. "It's strange. I used to wish it never happened, but now, I see how much good came from it." Naomi reached over and patted his hand. "That's the power of turning hurt into hope. It doesn't erase what happened, but it creates something better because of it." Across town, Linda finished her evening volunteer shift at the youth center. As she locked the door, she paused to look at the lights glowing softly inside. She didn't feel pride, just quiet gratitude that she was allowed to help. Crestwood had become a place of belonging, not perfect, but continually choosing to improve. The children growing up there now didn't carry the same weight of exclusion. They simply saw a community that cared, that opened its doors, that listened. And so the legacy lived on, not as a single viral moment, but as a lasting reminder that even in the smallest places, with the smallest actions, people could build a better world together. 2 decades had passed since that quiet Sunday morning when a single act of exclusion at St. Matthew's sparked a movement. Crestwood had grown into a thriving, welcoming town, known for its community-driven programs and its culture of acceptance. What was once a painful moment now lived on as a story of transformation, a story that continued to inspire new generations. The Open Arms Initiative had become a national organization. Its headquarters remained in Crestwood, but chapters had spread across dozens of towns and cities. The program worked with churches, schools, and youth centers, offering training on empathy and inclusion, and creating safe spaces for families everywhere. Naomi, now in her later years, spent most of her time in a peaceful rhythm. She often sat in her garden with a book, occasionally receiving visits from young leaders who came to seek her wisdom. She never took credit for the change that grew from that single incident. Instead, she would always say, "It wasn't me, it was all of us choosing differently." Angela continued her work behind the scenes, coordinating community events and supporting young families. David enjoyed retirement, often joining Angela in her efforts, quietly setting up tables for events or repairing things at the community center. Grace had returned to Crestwood after earning her degree and now directed the local youth services, carrying forward the mission that had shaped her childhood. And Jamal? He had become a respected figure across the state, not only for his nonprofit work, but for his ability to connect with young people. He traveled to schools and communities to talk about resilience, leadership, and the importance of creating spaces where everyone feels they belong. He always ended his talks with the same message. You can't control how the world sees you, but you can control how you respond, and sometimes your response can change the world around you. One warm summer day, Crestwood hosted the 25th anniversary of the Community Day of Unity. The town square was alive with music, food stalls, and laughter. Families who had moved away returned for the event, and newcomers from other towns joined, curious to see the place they'd heard about. At the center of the square stood a new monument, unveiled just that morning. It was a sculpture of open hands, cast in bronze, holding a small globe. An inscription at the base read, "In honor of the courage to welcome, the humility to learn, and the choice to grow together. Crestwood. A place for all." Naomi stood with Jamal and Grace, looking at the monument. She smiled quietly, her heart full. "This feels bigger than what we ever imagined," Angela said, coming up beside them. "It became bigger because people didn't let it stop with just words," Jamal added. "They kept building on it." As they talked, a young girl approached, holding her mother's hand. She looked up at Naomi with wide, curious eyes. "Are you the lady from the story my teacher told us?" she asked innocently. Naomi knelt down so she was at the child's level. "Maybe I am." "What story did your teacher tell you?" "She said one day a family was told they didn't belong," the girl replied, "but then the whole town changed and became nice to everyone. And now people from other towns come here to learn how to be kind too." Naomi smiled, gently brushing the girl's hair back. "Then yes, I guess I'm part of that story. But you know what's even better?" The girl tilted her head. "What?" "You're part of it now too. Every time you're kind, you keep the story going." The girl grinned, squeezing her mother's hand before running back to join other kids playing by the fountain. Nearby, Linda stood quietly with a group of volunteers handing out water bottles. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, but she still moved with quiet purpose. She had never sought public redemption, and she never would. But she had found her place in service. People in the community now greeted her politely, some even warmly. Over the years, she had proven, through action, not words, that she was no longer the same person who once blocked a family's path. As the sun set over the town square, Father Michael, now very old but still sharp-eyed, took the microphone. He spoke slowly, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Many years ago, this community was tested. We could have stayed silent, we could have turned away, but instead we faced our failing and chose to be better. Look around you now. This is the proof that even the smallest act of courage can echo for generations." The crowd applauded, some wiping away quiet tears. That evening, as the event wound down, Naomi and Jamal walked together toward the new monument. They stood in front of it for a long moment, the lights from the festival casting a warm glow over the bronze hands. "Mom," Jamal said softly, "do you think people will still remember this long after we're gone?" Naomi smiled gently. "They won't remember every detail, but they'll feel what this place became, and that feeling will keep moving forward, even if they don't know where it started." Jamal nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft evening light. "Then I guess it really was worth it." Naomi squeezed his hand. "It was always worth it." As the festival lights twinkled and the sound of laughter faded into the night, Crestwood stood as living proof that even a single painful moment could lead to a legacy of hope, unity, and belonging that would outlast the people who began it. And somewhere, in another small town miles away, someone heard the story and decided to start their own journey of change, just as Crestwood once had. Another decade rolled by, and the story of Crestwood had grown into something larger than any of its residents could have imagined. It was no longer just the tale of one church, one priest, one family, and one act of prejudice. It had become a movement, woven into textbooks, leadership courses, and community workshops around the country. Naomi, now living a peaceful life surrounded by her children and grandchildren, rarely spoke publicly anymore. But her name was still spoken with reverence in circles of social work, education, and community development. She would sometimes receive letters from young leaders she had never met. One letter read, "I'm writing from a small town in Ohio. We used Crestwood's story as inspiration to rebuild trust in our community after a similar incident. Because of what you all did, We were brave enough to face our own mistakes. Thank you for showing us it's possible." Naomi would smile softly when reading these letters, then tuck them away in a small wooden box she kept near her favorite chair. She didn't need recognition. Knowing the ripples continued was enough. Jamal's nonprofit, Belong on the Court, had grown into an international program. He traveled overseas, helping build community sports centers in areas where kids needed safe places to gather. Yet every summer, no matter how busy his schedule, he returned to Crestwood for the annual Community Day of Unity. During one visit home, Jamal walked through the now modernized youth center with Grace, who had become the director of all Crestwood youth initiatives. The walls were lined with photos of smiling children, volunteers, and community leaders. "Do you realize," Grace said, "this center wouldn't even exist if that one day hadn't happened?" Jamal nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, it's strange to think something that felt so small back then turned into this." Grace smiled. "Sometimes the smallest seeds grow into the biggest trees." Angela had become something of a matriarch for the initiative. Though she no longer organized day-to-day events, she was a trusted advisor for young coordinators. David, always quiet and steady, helped maintain the community spaces, often seen fixing playgrounds or carrying supplies during events. And Linda, her journey had been the most surprising of all. She had quietly dedicated the last years of her life to community service. She worked full-time at the youth center, organizing food drives, helping families in need, and mentoring volunteers. She never erased her past. In fact, when new volunteers asked her why she started, she would simply say, "Because I needed to learn what it really means to care about someone other than yourself." Linda never became a hero in anyone's story, but she became an example of what genuine accountability looked like: quiet, consistent, and humble. One spring, Crestwood hosted the National Conference on Inclusive Communities, attracting visitors from all over the country. Leaders from towns and cities gathered in the same square that once held only whispers of division. They walked through the community center, the church, and the youth programs, learning how a small town became a national model. At the conference's closing ceremony, Jamal took the stage. He stood tall, his voice carrying a calm authority earned over years of dedication. "This town wasn't always like this," he told the audience. "It started with one wrong moment, one act that showed us who we were, but instead of letting it define us, we used it to grow. What you see today isn't perfection, it's a choice we made every day to be better. You can make that choice too, wherever you are." The room erupted in applause. After the conference, a young woman approached Jamal. She was from a small rural town hundreds of miles away. "My church just went through something similar," she said. "We didn't know how to fix it. But after hearing Crestwood's story, I think we can start." Jamal smiled and shook her hand. "You can. It starts with just one step, one person willing to listen and act." That evening, as the conference ended, Naomi, Angela, Jamal, and Grace walked together through the quiet streets of Crestwood. The town square was now adorned with plaques and murals celebrating unity. Children played freely in the same courtyard that had once been tense with exclusion. They paused in front of the bronze sculpture of open hands holding the globe. It had become the heart of Crestwood, a symbol of what they had all built together. "Do you ever think," Angela asked softly, "about how different things would have been if Father Michael hadn't stepped in that day?" Naomi nodded slowly. "Yes, but I also think about how it wasn't just him. It was everyone who decided not to stay silent after that moment. That's what truly made the difference." Jamal placed his hand gently on the cold bronze. "And now, people who weren't even alive back then will still feel what this place stands for." Grace smiled. "Because it's not just our story anymore. It belongs to everyone who believes they can do better." Across the square, Linda was finishing her shift at the youth center. She looked over and saw the family standing by the monument. Their eyes met briefly, and she gave a small nod before walking quietly toward the church, where she now helped prepare meals for those in need. As the sun set, the warm golden light spilled over the town, highlighting the buildings, the people, and the paths they had all walked to get here. Crestwood was no longer defined by the moment of exclusion. It was defined by the decades of inclusion that followed. And somewhere, in another town, another community facing its own challenges heard Crestwood's story and decided to take the first step toward change. Because that is how legacies live on. Not in one act, but in the endless choices made afterward. Many decades later, Crestwood was no longer just a small town on the map. it had become a symbol etched into history. What once began as an ordinary community with its flaws and silences was now studied as an extraordinary example of what could happen when people chose humility, action, and compassion. The Open Arms Initiative had evolved into an international organization with programs in schools, religious institutions, and community centers across the globe. Its roots were traced back to a quiet Sunday morning in Crestwood, where one family's courage and one priest's calm intervention sparked a movement that rippled outward for generations. The youth center in Crestwood was now named the Naomi Carter Center for Community and Inclusion. Children ran through its halls daily, learning, playing, and building friendships with no barriers. On the walls hung portraits and murals telling the story of the town's transformation, not to glorify the pain, but to honor the growth. Inside one of the classrooms, a teacher spoke to a group of children. "Does anyone know why our town is famous?" she asked. A young boy raised his hand. "Because a long time ago, someone said a family couldn't sit in church," he said. "But then the priest said everyone belongs. And then the whole town changed." The teacher smiled. "That's right. And what do we learn from that?" A little girl replied confidently, "That even if something bad happens, you can make it into something good if you work together." Across the street, the bronze monument of the open hands still stood, polished and cared for over the years. Beneath it was a plaque that read, "From one act of exclusion grew generations of inclusion. May this town always remember where it began, and may it inspire those who visit to do the same." Visitors from all over came to see the monument. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they were facing similar struggles in their own communities and needed hope. One bright afternoon, a group of international students visited Crestwood. They gathered around the monument as their guide explained the story. Among them was a young girl who had experienced prejudice in her own school. She listened intently, her eyes wide with wonder. "So, they fixed it?" she asked softly. The guide smiled. "They didn't fix it overnight. They chose every single day to keep getting better, and they still do." Naomi's grandchildren now carried on her quiet legacy. They served on the board of the initiative and visited towns around the country to help others create similar programs. They always spoke of their grandmother's humility and strength. Jamal's children had taken over Belong on the Court, expanding it further, integrating leadership and education alongside sports. They told stories of their father's early days in Crestwood, how he stayed calm in the face of unfairness, and how he chose to respond with dignity. Grace's own children were part of the community choir at St. Matthew's, which had grown to include kids from every background imaginable. The church itself was now more than a place of worship. It was a living museum of unity, hosting visitors from around the world who wanted to learn from its history. And Linda's story had not been erased. In fact, she was remembered in a way that surprised many. At the Naomi Carter Center, a quiet plaque bore her name, not as a hero, but as a reminder. Even those who falter can choose to change. True accountability is a lifelong journey. It was a lesson that resonated deeply with those who visited, that redemption was possible, but only through honest work and humility. Every year, the anniversary of the Open Arms Initiative was marked with a festival in Crestwood. Generations gathered in the town square, now beautifully renovated with gardens, murals, and open spaces for children to play. Families who had once felt like outsiders now celebrated as part of the Crestwood family. On the 50th anniversary, a special ceremony was held. A young community leader, who hadn't even been born when it all began, took the stage. "We were taught that this movement began with one act of courage," she said. "But what I've learned is that it wasn't just courage, it was persistence. The people of this town didn't stop after the first step. They kept choosing to listen, to grow, to build something better. And now it's our turn to keep choosing the same." The crowd applauded, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns strung across the square. Later that evening, as the festival music faded into the night, Naomi's great-grandchildren stood by the bronze monument. One of them traced the engraved words with their fingers and whispered, "They really changed everything, didn't they?" Another nodded, "Yeah, and now it's our job to keep it going." As the stars appeared overhead, Crestwood was quiet again. But it was not the same quiet town it had been before. It was a place forever defined by what happened after that day, a place where people chose to heal, to grow, and to create a future that was brighter than its past. And far beyond Crestwood, in communities that had never even heard of the town before, the lessons continued to travel. proving that a single act, no matter how small, could echo endlessly when met with courage and compassion. The story of Crestwood became timeless, passed down not as a tale of shame, but as a beacon of what was possible. Because even one painful moment could become the root of something beautiful, if people were willing to nurture it.